Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome. So as you come in, it automatically mutes you. So I want you to go ahead and unmute yourself for a second. We're just going to give a few minutes for people to find the link. But I'd invite you to go ahead and go ahead and adjust your name. So add your name and your preferred pronouns, maybe where you're joining from. If you can. I know we have folks from all over our region, from Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and it'd be nice to just kind of check in and say hello to each other before we begin. This is Monday Night Knowledge Camp and the Politics of Jesus with Reverend Dr. Chuck Currie. We're going to get started here in a second. I'm Reverend Adam Hange. I'm the pastor of Hillsboro UCC and the immediate past moderator. So I handed off the gavel on Saturday. But we're so glad you're here. Just a second, and we're going to go around and introduce ourselves. I want to remind you that tonight's conversation is being recorded, and we hope to post this on YouTube. So we'll cut off the part that has all of our immediate personal information as we kind of say hello, but you can just introduce yourself, say your first name and where you're joining us from. That would be great. I'm going to start over here with Carl. Carl, would you introduce yourself and say hi?
Hi, I'm Carl Van Slyke from Meridian, Idaho. I'm a member at Wright Church in Boise. Welcome.
Glad you could be here. And Kay, do you want to introduce yourself?
I'm Kay Exo from Bridgeport, UCC in Portland, Oregon. Happy to be here.
Okay, so glad you could join us. Welcome.
Sure.
And Teddy, you want to say hello?
Yes, hi, I'm Teddy Hyde. I'm from the Medford Congregational United Church of Christ in Medford.
Great, welcome. So glad you could be here.
Thank you, Adam.
And I'm going to jump to Marge. Marge, you're muted, but if you unmute, you can say hello real quick.
Margie?
Yep. Hi, I'm Margie Murch, also from the Medford UCC. Happy to be here.
Margie, so glad you could join us. Welcome. And let's say hi to Francis. Welcome, Francis. How are you doing? Can you hear us okay? Okay, Francis, we're going to come back, but I'm glad you're here, and I hope you can hear. If you have any questions, remember you can write in the chat and let us know if you have a question or any technical difficulties. Kathy, do you want to say hello and where you're joining us from?
Yeah, I'm Kathy Rise from Lake Oswego United Church of Christ.
Well, welcome, Kathy. So glad you're here. Gabrielle, you want to say hello? Oh, it automatically starts on mute, so please.
Thank you. I'm Gabrielle and Brewer Wallen, and I'm from Salem, UCC.
Welcome. And Carl, you're muted, but you want to say hello real quick? There you go.
Sure. Carl Verkuden and the Dows. Congratulations, Chuck.
Thank you. Thank you.
Tournament award. Well deserved.
Thank you so much.
Well, welcome to you, Carl, and welcome, Chuck. We're so glad you are here to share with us today this program on the politics of Jesus. It's a very good time for this conversation. And if you don't already know, you probably do, but Chuck is the chaplain of Pacific University and the director of the Center for Peace and Spirituality there. And he is a very, very accomplished social media presence who's a good voice for the UCC in the public discourse and the public square. And there's really no one better to have this conversation. So Chuck, we're going to turn it over to you, and I'm going to invite others. If you'd like to, you could turn it to speaker view. You can even hide your own view. So sometimes I don't like looking at myself in the camera, and it, studies have been done that say it stresses you out. So you're invited, if you'd like to turn off your video, you can do that. We will have some Q&A time at the end, but we're going to turn it over to you, Chuck. And thank you for being here. Welcome.
Well, thank you for having me, Adam, and it's a pleasure to join all of y'all tonight. I've been to to many of your churches, but not all of them. And certainly I recognize a lot of the names of folks who are here. And so I'm happy to see you all. It may come as a huge shock to you all, but there's a national election coming up just a little over a month now. It's been a little bit divisive so far, and I imagine it will only get uglier as the weeks go on. But I wanted to spend a little time at the invitation of the conference committee speaking with you about the role of the church and the role of clergy in political life. And the role of both is a little bit different, a little bit distinct. So we'll talk about that. And we'll also talk about how social media can be used as a tool for engaging in prophetic witness around political issues. And that's a little bit different than partisan issues that we'll talk about as well. So I'm going to start a PowerPoint that I have, if the technology gods are with me. And we will start to walk through some of this material. As we do, you are certainly welcome to ask questions that you may have, and I would be happy to answer those as we go along. The other thing that you can do, of course, is to put those into chat, and hopefully I will see them in the chat, or maybe Adam will, and we can answer them together. So this is about the questions, of course. So one of the questions that we all wrestle with is, what role should faith leaders and faith institutions play in the political sphere? In 2007, the United Methodist Social Principles read this way: the United Methodist Church believes that the church has the moral imperative to act for the common good. For people of faith, therefore, there are no political or spiritual spheres where their participation can be denied. The attempt to influence the formation and execution of public policy at all levels of government is often the most effective means available to churches to keep before humanity the ideal of a society in which power and order are made to serve the ends of justice and freedom for all people. So what the Methodists have essentially argued is that there are no areas where people of faith should not be involved. And I would agree with that. Although, again, I do think there are some differences between faith leaders and those who are in churches. So let's talk about that. What is partisan or nonpartisan? Churches are prohibited from engaging in partisan political activity. And the best way to describe that, it's pretty simple. Churches cannot support a candidate or a political party, but churches may advocate on public policy issues, such as legislation before your city council, state legislature, or Congress and the White House, or ballot measures that are being voted on. Churches can endorse on those, churches can speak out on those, but what churches cannot do is speak out on behalf of candidates or political parties. That would violate the 501c3 status of your church and could lead, and you certainly wouldn't want this, you could lead to losing your tax exempt status. Although I will say that in recent years, more and more conservative churches have tested this by having their church endorse political candidates, and the IRS has not come down on them as has previously been the case. We can look at this this page of guidelines for congregations and clergy on political action. Can y'all all see that? You cannot see it. Okay, well, I'm just going to read parts of it to you. As a 501c3 tax-exempt organization, a church is exempt from paying corporate taxes, and donations to it are tax-deductible on federal returns. And those organizations may expend funds for religious, charitable, or educational purposes, and an insubstantial amount on lobbying and to promote legislation. So that means your church can actually spend money to support a ballot measure or hold events in support of a ballot measure. What I recommend doing before you ask your church to ever endorse a ballot measure, if it has not been done before, is to develop a policy for the church so that you have a set policy that anyone can follow to bring issues before your church council or the entire church organization so that you don't get in trouble with your members later on. As an example of this, a number of years ago, one of the churches that I worked with at the time organized a response to one of the anti-gay ballot measures that Oregon voters were facing. We put on a rally for people of faith in support of gay and lesbian rights. And we did an offering that we brought in, I think it was either $15,000 or $20,000 that was then donated to the campaign. Not a lot of churches do that. It's unusual, but I do think if you have a policy that it's not a bad thing to consider doing. So you can talk about politics in church, you can endorse ballot measures, you can promote discussion of public policy, but what your church cannot do, again, and this is very important, is to endorse political candidates. If you invite political parties to use your church, for example, if you rent space, you have to offer that same space to any other political party or candidate who wants the space at the same amount of money. So again, you want to make sure that you're very careful on that. Now, is the PowerPoint still up? Can y'all see that? Okay, so y'all can see the PowerPoint. Thank you. Let's go on here. Oops. So Scripture teaches that we have a responsibility as the people of God to be actively involved in the life of the world. That means the role of the church is sometimes to lift up difficult issues and put them before the public. This is what abolitionists in our churches did during the era of slavery. This is what civil rights marchers did in churches during the civil rights movement. And that is what our churches are doing today and calling for economic policies, for example, that reduce poverty and lift up children. Politicians, however, have learned that they can win elections by finding those so-called wedge issues that divide people along religious, economic, and racial lines. They hope that raising these issues will increase voter turnout in some areas and suppress it in others. Division is a tool in politics, but we shouldn't be about division as the church. We should be a community concerned about reconciliation. And so if the church is to become involved with political issues, we need to be very careful about the language we use and the tactics we employ. Our actions should always be undertaken with care and in prayer. So let me give you a quick example that just came to me last night. I've been noticing on social media a lot of personal attacks on the children of the new Supreme Court nominee, whose nomination I oppose. But I've seen attacks on her interracial family and how that family came together, and attacks directly related to her children. And I said on Twitter that we really ought to remove the children of public figures from our political discussions. And a faith-based organization asked me why we would do that. Aren't the policies that the Supreme Court nominee that she embodies, aren't they harmful to children? And if so, why can't we be critical of her children and her family? I think that that is something that happens a lot with political organizations, but we are not a political organization, certainly not in the traditional sense. We ought to hold ourselves to something of a higher standard. And if we can't agree not to attack the children of public figures as kind of a baseline, I would be worried about what we do in politics. One way that we can avoid inflaming tensions is to be particularly careful about how we invoke the name of God. Too often, churches deeply concerned about issues have told the public that God wants them to vote one way or another on Measure X. Let's stay away from that and be humble enough to recognize that there is always the potential that we can be wrong. After all, we're only human. When we do endorse issues, it should be said that we do so with our best understanding of where God is calling us as a people, but room should also be left for those who disagree with us to know that they are God's people too. The church does not have a monopoly on the truth. And I think about issues, for example, like abortion, which is so contentious and again is becoming a central focus of this presidential campaign, and the number of clergy and the number of churches who say you cannot support a pro-choice candidate and still remain a Christian. I think that language is difficult, and we should try and avoid it however we can. So in thinking theologically, I want to talk a little bit about context, and I'm using liberation theology as kind of the guidepost for this part of the discussion. Social media provides the opportunity or the capacity for reaching audiences far outside the hall of worship. One of the great things some of you may have noticed because of COVID, then you put your services online. A lot of smaller churches are now reaching wider audiences. I've been arguing for people to put their services online for years and years. This is what the more conservative right-wing churches do. And so this pandemic has had a nice side benefit that I hope that we continue to promote ourselves more assertively. Before considering how one might use social media in ministry, it's worth considering what theological insights we might bring to the most pressing issues being faced by humanity within the context of our aim of creating space for a just peace that brings us closer to the kingdom of God. This wonderful book written by Susan Thistlethwaite argues that liberation theologies have said from the very beginning that social location is important, that the context in which one does theology significantly shapes the method, content, and structures of theology. Thus, how faith communities respond to issues of racism, for example, in Ferguson, Missouri, will be different from Portland, Oregon, based on differences in racial diversity, history, religious makeup, income, and other social factors. In American culture, where the pull yourself up by your bootstraps myth of individuality are so strong, communal understandings of Christian social action in support of social goals may be difficult for some social classes to understand or accept, particularly those who believe that they have made it on their own and stand apart from societal forces. Therefore, it is of particular importance that those involved in public theology, and this is what we're discussing here is public theology, have some sense of critical consciousness, the place we inhabit in the world. Such knowledge might mean that we step back if we inhabit positions of privilege and follow the leadership and example of those more directly impacted by the issues we are attempting to address. So for much of the current debate over Black Lives Matter, I've appreciated that so many white clergy in the United States, particularly from mainline, more progressive denominations, have stepped back to make sure that their Black and brown colleagues are heard, and that our voices are in support, not in place of. The book continues to go on to say that theologies of liberation are profoundly communal theologies serving to express the faith, hope, and charity of communities of Christians. The polity of the United Church of Christ actually is ideal in this sense. Unlike many denominations which place significant authority in the office of the minister, the UCC invests power in the laity at the local church level, and the national setting of the denominations speak to local churches, but not for local churches. This allows for enormous freedom in the people of the church, or at conference or even the general synod level, to do theological work out of their own social context, but always in communion with other churches and conferences and the national church. It may be that this investment of trust of people to encounter God with one another, rather than having God's word dictated to them by a bishop or a pope, is part of the reason that the UCC has been a church that has, through communal action, been the first denomination to take many controversial stands that advance causes of liberation. At its core, liberation theology is a theology of protest against unjust social orders and a theology aimed at social transformation towards greater justice for all. Engagement in such a theology brings risk because unjust social systems fight back. When Dr. King was assassinated, it was not simply an attack on an individual, but it was also an attack on the church universal, an attack on African Americans, and an attack on all those concerned about racial equality. Perhaps from my viewpoint, and others will argue with it, one of the greatest mistakes of King's heirs was to enshrine his legacy through a Memorial Day that marked the man instead of the radical, prophetic, Christian-inspired movement that he organized for. It's allowed people to so often co-opt Dr. King's message. Now, it's important to remember that clergy and denominational leaders are public figures. There's a couple things that I would recommend to clergy who want to get involved. First, if you want to engage in public theology through social media on Facebook, Twitter, and other social media platforms, create a public figure account where possible. Facebook has this, Instagram has this, Twitter does not, but some other social media platforms do. A public figure platform is different than the individual platform that you may have on Facebook. An individual's platform, you will see people posting pictures of their family, a picture of their social life. You can only have 5,000 friends on Facebook. For most of us, of course, that's a huge amount of people. A public figure account is somewhat different. I have a public figure account. I think there's around 38,000 or more people who are following it now. I don't post pictures, for example, of my children on that account. Because I've received threats and my family has received threats. So we create a private Facebook account, which friends are able to log on to, but the public cannot see, and then a public figure account where I can talk about these issues without having to worry so much about my family being impacted. If you're going to be involved in public theology in any way, always use your real name. I'm amazed at the number of people who in their bio will say that they are the leader of a church, the moderator of a church, but then they don't use their real name. They use an anonymous account. And that means that they can't be held accountable for any of the information that they're posting. And while I understand that that might be more comfortable for some folks, it's irresponsible, in my opinion. If you're going to be a minister speaking out on issues, if you're going to be a lay church leader speaking out on issues, note your position, say who you are, but also offer a disclaimer. Say whether you're speaking for yourself or your church or not. On all of my public accounts, there is a disclaimer saying, I don't speak on behalf of the UCC. I don't speak on behalf of my church. I'm a member at Ainsworth here in Northeast Portland. I don't speak on behalf of Pacific University. If you're mad about something, come to me directly. That, by the way, does not stop anybody from emailing Pacific University to say how much they dislike what I'm saying, but it makes Pacific a little bit more comfortable because I have included a disclaimer. Social media, which all of our churches are using, helps us amplify our voices. And there are particular moments in the life in our community when it is important to hear from people of faith. I would argue particularly important to hear from progressive people of faith because our more conservative brothers and sisters in the religious right are very good at this, and our voices are often left out. So a moment of national crisis, of course, would be the Ferguson events close to Eden Theological Seminary in St. Louis, the George Floyd murder, the more recent George Floyd murder, Hurricane Sandy, even the wildfires here in Oregon and Washington, to talk about the link between climate change and growing wildfire seasons. It's important that you use your voice to offer a message grounded in theology. Otherwise, you risk sounding like a political operative. I would have some criticism even of our faith-based advocacy arms of the UCC and the National Council of Churches and others who do great work in lifting stuff up, but often don't address issues in a theological way. So take a look at any of the recent action alerts that have come out from Justice and Witness Ministry. And again, I use them all the time. I share them with people. They're very helpful, but they don't sound very different than what moveon.org might send out as an action alert. There's very little theology tied with the issue that they're lifting up. And I think that that is important because there are already plenty of political operatives out there. We ought to talk about theology, about where we see God in this moment and in this place. It's great if you can coordinate with local and national colleagues about the message that you will use to respond to. I'm part of a couple of different groups where we share talking points with each other every morning so that we have a sense of what's going to be in the news that day and what we might say, where we can come to some consensus and have a unified progressive message of faith out there. If you don't know what to say on some issue, whether it's a school shooting or climate change or the wildfires, look at the statements that are issued by the national offices of the UCC or the National Council of Churches. Even if they don't lift up theology so much, they will lift up a lot of really good information and ways that you can connect with elected officials to talk about those issues that you find particularly important to you. If you are, if you're on social media or you haven't gotten on yet, just be aware that it does take time to develop a following on social media. I think Twitter remains the best tool for social media. I know that more and more people, there are a lot of people on Facebook, but the demographics are changing. When you first create a social media account, you want to identify people to follow. There's a good chance they'll follow you back. If you look for those who are journalists in your community, opinion makers, follow them on Twitter or Facebook, I'll bet you money that they will, they'll connect with you. And then when a breaking story hits, make sure that on Facebook and Twitter, and certainly I would add Instagram. Instagram is the way that I connect with students at Pacific more than any other tool. My daughters are on Snapchat. I know a lot of kids use Snapchat. I've not tried to do that yet because I feel like I've already got enough social media accounts. And you have to be short and pithy in your statements because you're dealing with character limits. No one's going to read an article from me or you for the most part unless it's in a newspaper. So your statements have to be short and to the point. I would also say that beyond using social media, that when one of these big incidents occurs and there's a need for some sort of response or witness to it, send out a press release to the media. Which means you're going to have to maintain a database of media context that is integrated with social media. Constant Contact is the tool that I use, but there are others that are out there. The media is generally looking for reactions from community leaders to breaking news. And if they are following you on Twitter or Facebook and they see a press release in their inbox, there's a good chance they will come to you for a comment instead of searching someone out. So my most recent silly example of that was a couple of weeks ago when the windstorm first hit. I posted some videos of the windstorm by the park next to our house, and within a couple of minutes got press calls, and then Channel 8 was out in front of the house interviewing me about the wind, which I found very odd and strange, but there it was. I would also say, please make sure that your church website is updated at all times, that it's integrated with social media. That will help you get your message out. Put your press statements on your website and make sure that people are able to share those statements on social media so that you get a better readership. Even if you don't get in the news for what it is that you were saying, your message can still spread on social media, sometimes in ways that outpace traditional media. And I will say that I go to a lot of websites, church websites, in the conference and other places, and so often they are not updated. They're 6 months behind, or in some cases, years behind. And not only does that make you less relevant to the community when big things are happening, it also means that people won't come to your church. If they see your website is out of date, they may think you're closed. They may think that you're not active. Particularly young people are looking for those Instagram links, those Twitter links. Older people are looking for Facebook, and that's certainly a shift in the last 10 years. Building up your social media presence is all about building online relationships. Friend people, follow people, share the work that others are doing that you believe to be important. Others will return the favor once they begin to know and trust your work. I'll say that 90% of my work on social media is not lifting up my own voice, but trying to lift up other voices that I appreciate, that I honor, and think that need to be heard and feel like might be able to be heard in ways that they couldn't have. People like me don't lift them up. Remember, there's always risk involved in this work. no matter what or how you say it. Sometimes people will disagree, and others will simply label your statements as political. You need to develop a thick skin, work in collaboration with colleagues, and not in isolation. I will say, I mentioned it before, I do get threats because of my work, and that can be exhausting. Sometimes it has picked up over the last 4 years in ways I could never have imagined. And as we get closer to the election, it's truly astonishing. I had in just the last 24 hours, over 10,000 Donald Trump supporters send me emails, phone calls, and messages on social media and at home because they were upset with my pro-choice stance and my concern with the Supreme Court nomination. And some of those, unfortunately, have to go right to the FBI to be reviewed. And while I'm certainly happy to take any questions, if you want to contact me, you can do so through Pacific. I am in a transition period, of course, where I'm currently on medical leave and anticipate that becoming permanent in the next couple of weeks. But my email address still works, my website still works, and I'm happy to take questions from all of you. And so I'd love to hear anything that you have to say in response to this and any questions that you might have.
Well, thank you so much, Chuck. That was wonderful. A great introduction to this topic, and some news we can use right now. I think if so many of us are seeing things online and trying to know how to respond, and it's not easy all the time, but there's definitely some better best practices, and so much is changing so fast, so yes. It's really helpful to kind of learn. Do you have any questions in our group here that we could ask Chuck while we have him with us? Anything particular about social media or politics in the church, or the UCC, and how do you lift up a progressive voice?
I do see there were a couple comments left in the chat, but I'm not able to see them all. So if anyone had anything there they wanted to share, this would be the time.
Well, we had a question. I did a quick poll if anyone had one of those policies in their church about how to talk about, like, can you support an issue? And we had a couple I don't knows, but no one said for sure that there was one.
Don Frew or Gabriella would know better what's going on at Park Rose now, but when I was the interim at Park Rose for a number of years, we developed a policy there, and they may still have it in place. And it was kind of a tiered policy. The minister could speak on behalf of the church on social issues on which the church had already taken a stand. So the church had taken a stand on some immigration issues, LGBTQ issues. And so I could go out to the community and speak on behalf of the church. If it was a new issue, like a ballot measure that was coming out, we would bring that to the church council and allow the church council to debate that and decide whether it was appropriate or not to endorse. If it was a new issue that the church had never considered before, and there are always those new and emerging issues, even if it impacted our ability to speak about it timely, we felt that it was important for the health of the church and the church community to pause on taking a stand on that issue and to bring it to a full meeting of the congregation where we could bring in people to talk about both sides of the issue and then to make a decision as to whether or not we felt comfortable taking a stance. And that allowed a lot of participation in the process, and people felt a lot more comfortable about what we did once that policy was in place.
Thank you. So Margie says that she's a moderator for her church, and she gets bombarded with questions like, why aren't you such and such? Why aren't you just peace? Why aren't you immigrant welcoming? Why aren't, so how do you answer that for a person who's the moderator and maybe has to hold space for a very diverse community? You have any advice?
I think that's a really important question. you know, I look at two churches in our conference that I know pretty well. First Congregational United Church of Christ in downtown Portland, which has been really on the forefront about speaking on a lot of issues. Ainsworth United Church of Christ is another like that. And there's a culture in the church that allows for those discussions to happen. People are used to it. It's been going on for a very long time. In some other churches where that culture doesn't exist about talking about these issues, it can be a lot more, you know, difficult. If people are asking, why is your church not a just peace church? Or why is your church not open and affirming? It might be time to go ahead and start a study group about that. You know, the UCC provides numerous resources for how to become a just peace church or how to become open and affirming. At Park Rose, when I arrived there, the congregation was very divided. About half the church was not speaking to the other half of the church. And they told me the reason for that is the church council had decided to move the pews, so they were facing a different direction. And that didn't seem like a reason not to talk to people to me. And so spending time with members and listening there, what I realized is that the church had been in the midst of a 20-year debate over whether or not to become open and affirming. And there was a lot of fear that if the church ever took a vote on it, that people would leave and the church would be hurt. I spent a lot of time trying to listen to people and listen to their fears. What I found, though, in those discussions is that the fear was overstated compared to the reality. There weren't that many people who were opposed to being open and affirming. There was a very small group, and they were very vocal. And we decided to go ahead and call the question. And it had been brought, two studies had been done over 20 years. They had brought it up for a vote twice and then came back from the vote and never held it. So we held the vote. After some more discussion, 90% of the congregation voted to become open and affirming, and 10% of the church left. And that was hard, but it was also the only way that the church was going to be able to grow. It needed to have a shared identity and be something unique and different than any other mainline church that was in the neighborhood. And a progressive theological identity is one that can help churches grow. The upside to it is that after those folks left, we had almost an equal amount of people join the church over the next month who had been waiting. And I didn't realize this, to be honest. I didn't realize this was going to happen. They've been waiting to see if the church would support them or people in their families or people who they cared about and loved. And they weren't going to commit to being a member until that happened. And Park Rose, which was on the verge of closure 15 years ago, just finished a very successful 10-year ministry with Don, their first openly gay minister at the church after all that debate over being open and affirming, and are getting ready to call a new minister, and they're doing quite well. I think you just have to sometimes take the plunge into those really hard conversations. And the great thing about the UCC is that we do provide you with the tools for holding those conversations.
Thank you, Chuck, and thank you, Margie, for that great question. Gabrielle.
Hi, Chuck. We're in a little bit of a different situation in Salem. We can vote on things pretty easily. We will, we're open and affirming, we're just peace, we're, all these things. And actually a pretty long time ago, we were one of the first, so we've got a lot to be proud of, but we kind of talk a good talk. And so I'm on the board, but it's sometimes frustrating to feel like I'd like there to be some more action. Yes. Some more feet and hands behind our words. And then there is a lot of fear. I'm sure it's somewhat like what you were saying to Margie as well, but we can't put a sign because we might get vandalized. We can't, blah, 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 blah. And it sounds like so many excuses. And when I read the title of this presentation, I just thought, I don't feel in my heart, am I scared? You betcha. But I don't feel in my heart that Jesus would say, well, I'm not going to do that because I might get vandalized.
Right.
Like,
Right.
I don't see how we can be both things. And I don't know how to go forward as just a member of a congregation.
Well, that's a really good question. And I appreciate it. You know, I spent about 6 months at First Church in Salem.
Yeah, that's when I first saw you.
Yeah. And I loved my time there, but even then you know, that was something you could pick up on. You know, there was, and I think that's true for a lot of churches. We feel like the work is done after we say we're a just peace church, or we're a church welcoming of immigrants. So I think part of the reality is we constantly have to be in conversation with one another about what that means. What does it mean to live out the statements that we are having? One thing that you can do that I think, well, there's a couple things I would recommend. One, run for your church council, you know, and are you on your church council?
Yeah.
Yeah. So there you go. You're in a place already of leadership to help bring these issues up. But I think that holding anniversary celebrations, for example, like this is the 20th year we said we were welcoming of immigrants, right? Or whatever it is, just make up an excuse to hold not just a celebration, but also a theological discussion, you know, about where do you go from here? You know, you've taken this step, but what's the next step? Bring in community leaders who can come in and speak to what the needs are. And the needs may, in some cases, be shelter, food, but they may also be lobbying in Salem, you know, at the state capitol. And I've always thought First Church in Salem was just, you know, the church that people should be looking at and focused at when the Capitol's in session. You know, y'all are just so well set up for that, to be the prophetic moral voice of the state capitol. And I would love it if that was part of the mission of First Church Salem, but that's not my church, it's your church. So,
well, thank you for that reminder that you know, I feel like we have an obligation personally.
Yes, I do too. I mean, I get, you know, like yesterday when I got this slew of emails and phone calls and stuff, you know, it's exhausting, you know, and I have to go through all that. And honestly, it takes, there's damage to my soul, you know, and some of the stuff that people say. And if they attack my family, of course, you know, I get very unhappy. But I also feel like I don't have a choice. You know, when I accepted the call to ministry, I was told that it might be hard. I knew that it probably would be hard in times. But we find ourselves in this particular moment of history, which is unique. And we shouldn't downplay how unique and challenging it is. And if we aren't willing in this moment to be that prophetic voice, then we fail just as deeply as those white Christian churches who refused to speak out during the civil rights movement. We fail just as deeply, and history will judge us just as harshly.
Thank you. And thank you for that great question, Gabrielle. Teddy has her hand raised. Teddy, do you want to unmute and then ask your question? Oh, sorry, I'm going to ask you to unmute. So.
There we go.
You know, you said you had some health issues, and I think if I had 10,000 emails coming at me, I wonder if that's part of what's happening to you. I think I'm on a Just Peace team in our church, and there's about 20 of us that we are immersed in all kinds of community work and politics and everything. Where it's not so much the wider church, but we do things as, you know, to teach it. Anyway, we go to Salem, we lobby, we have some community organizers and ministers in that group. So it's a strong group. And I think it's helped us become an open and affirming church, and a church that's creation justice. You know, we've jumped through those kind of places to broaden our work. But I think individually, like I joined Emerge and got into a sacred circle here in Ashland we have about 12 people in that group. And from that, I got into the Poor People's Campaign nationally and the Poor People's Campaign in Oregon. And then we have like leadership you know, like neighborhood leaders here with getting out the vote. In Medford, you know, we have like, I have 70 people to call and urge them to get out the vote. So we do just a little tiny bit of what you do. I'm not into social media, so that would be a huge jump for me, because I don't even do Facebook. My family knows that I kind of, you know, I'm just a Facebook dud. And so I'm in awe of you that you can do this work. And I feel like you're doing the work for all of us in a way. But we're doing the best we can, I guess. And with the fires and with COVID,
yes,
our community is really stressed to the max.
Yes. Well,
you know, yeah, Margie just brought in a family that she didn't even know to live in her home since the fire has happened, you know. So I think we are doing Jesus's work.
Yes.
But in a very small scale, maybe, compared to what you're doing in Portland.
You know, I wouldn't say that. I would, I think that, like I said earlier, context is really important in this work. And my context is different than your context. It doesn't mean that one of us is doing more or better. I think that you should be really proud of the work that you're doing. And, you know, I can't tell you how important it is, like you said, going down to Salem and being part of these different organizations. That's incredibly important work. Offering up space for a family that has had to flee a fire. Imagine what that says to that family and to the community around them, and what that says about God. You know, that God's love is spurring people to action. And so context is very important. And I think that you should be very proud of what it is that you're doing. I'm inspired by you.
Okay. And I'm inspired by Margie. So Margie, I just found out that she's doing that. I was like, whoa, that's great. So we have like 2,700 homes that have been burned down here. So all those people are homeless, and those were like, you know, affordable housing. And so creating affordable housing for people is pretty tough.
Which has always been a big issue in Ashland, you know. So yeah, I mean, it's probably compounded by all of this. So yeah,
I imagine sometimes, you know, focusing on an issue like housing, affordable housing, instead of the politics of, you know, partisan politics, like that is one way for many churches to begin entering in this work. I mean, I think in Hillsborough, local Moms Demand Action for, you know, common sense gun reform, that group could be a very divided, it's definitely a wedge issue. It could be very partisan, but it was bipartisan in many ways because people cared about their kids. And that's really where it was born out of. So I think in your context there, I just want to echo what you've said, Chuck, is, you know, look at what the issues are where you are and kind of say, well, what is God calling us to do right now? Are there other questions folks have? We have just a few more minutes here. Yes, Kay.
I'm muting.
I just want to offer support for Gabrielle. And I don't know you, but my heart goes out to you because I want to offer support from another church for you and your work. And also, if you have people that you know in the conference that you can reach out to and say, I need support for what I'm going to do, or what I'm going to plan, or, you know, I believe in that, the mutual support for us as churches.
We are better together.
Yes,
yes.
Absolutely. Well,
I have a question.
Yes, Margie.
Dr. Currie, just, you know, the whole social media, Facebook and whatever, and Southern Oregon, I don't know if it's unique in terms of the state, we are incredibly far. There's a group that's incredibly far right, to the point of sometimes I get in fear of even talking to my neighbors who are flying huge Trump flags.
Yes.
I'm just going to say it.
Sure.
But we are loving, close friends. The fence has not created ill will. How do you, as a person, deal with these 10,000 emails? Is there a process that you go through to separate that into the trash, or send this to the FBI, or actually address it?
I have a separate email address for the public, that I don't give out, and my friends don't use. I have a work email address, a public email address, and then a private email address, for just family. And so the emails all come into that public, and what everybody gets when they write to that, because the volume's so high, there's just an automatic message that goes out saying, thank you, I'm gonna do my best to read all these emails, but I'm not gonna have a time to respond to you. And there's also a feature on my website that if people want more information, if they want to find a church, for example, it'll give you the UCC Find a Church link. If you want to get involved in advocacy, you'll get information on Faithful America, one of the groups that I work with in DC. There's a link that you can go to find out more about my own theology. So people who are really interested will look at those things and probably not send me hate mail. But I go through those very quickly during the day and look for particular words on the search function, and figure out what I need to send on to somebody else, and what is just angry people wanting to disagree. I don't mind that. I'm originally from South Carolina. I still spend a lot of time in South Carolina, go there for family stuff. They're furious with Trump, by the way. They're hardcore conservative Republicans. They're mad at him about immigration. They're mad at him about the way he talks about veterans. They're all veterans. So there are some big things that have upset them. But my whole life, I've had family members who are incredibly close to me who disagree with me on just about every issue, whether it's theology or politics or social. I decided a long time ago, and this was my mother's prompting more than anything else. My late mother, who very much agreed with me, thought like me on these things, said you don't lose your family over this stuff. You find ways to find common ground. And that's one of the hardest things to do. But it also has made me hopeful in the long run that if I can still sit down, not just at Thanksgiving dinner or Christmas, but if I can talk to my uncle on the phone every night, knowing that he disagrees with me on some important issues, and talk about our families and talk about our lives and say we love each other at the end of the call. If I can do that with my cousins, that gives me some hope for the future of the country. So I think those relationships are particularly important. They break down stereotypes. They help us see the image of God in other people. So I think it's important to sustain those relationships, and I applaud you for trying to do that. Sometimes it doesn't work. I've lost some friends over the years, particularly because of social media, because they have started to post stuff that was obscenely racist, and I would try and talk to them about it. And social media allowed a side of a lot of people to come out that I might not have otherwise seen.
Yeah.
But I've had to back away from some relationships over the years, and I always grieve those. They're not hard, and it's not nice. And I would hope maybe the reconciliation is in the future somewhere.
Thank you for everything you're doing.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Adam, you're muted now.
Yeah. I think we have time for maybe one last question, if there's any. If not, I have one. Well, Chuck, I want to say thank you. And all right, so I want your quick elevator speech. Someone asks you, Jesus wasn't political. What do you say?
I get that all the time. Well, one thing I remind them is that Jesus was, after marching into Jerusalem and occupying the city, he was put to death by the Roman Empire that he opposed. And he wasn't put to death for a religious crime. He was crucified. And crucifixion was reserved for political crimes. And Jesus was an enemy to Rome, and there's nothing more political than being an enemy to Rome.
Thank you. It's a good answer. And thank you all for joining in this conversation. If you have other questions, Chuck, would you just kind of drop your contact email into the chat? So if people want to send that to you, they can follow up later on. Again, we'll have this recorded and we'll try to get it posted onto our CPC YouTube page in the next couple of days. So if you loved what you heard today, you can share it with your friends or with your board or anyone who you'd like to talk to, those cousins. You can talk with them about it. But I want to say thank you for joining this conversation. These are especially trying times, and I know that it's also really important that we are the church right now, that we lift up prophetic voice in this politically charged environment and bear witness for all the things we believe in. So I encourage you to do that. And I got a little swag from UCC this week. So I got not 1, 2, but 3 compliments today when I wore this out.
Nice.
So if you haven't got yours, you can still get them. There's still time. But thank you, everyone. This was really wonderful. Chuck, could I ask you just to say a quick blessing as we close our time?
Sure, I'd be glad to do that. Let's be in a time of prayer together.
Thank you.
Gracious God, in a season of chaos, we seek you out. You have stilled the waters before, and we ask you to do so again now. Give us the strength and the courage to live out your mission for us, to help free the oppressed, to love those who are around us, regardless of who they are or where they may have come from. Give us the fortitude to be strong and the wisdom to know when we might be wrong. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen.